And then you can see them all the way down the right-of-way as you approach the middle of town.
Get a shot of this.
Yeah, we have a new little critter in here. They brought a burro in to protect the horses.
Now, what does a burro do to protect the horses?
They kick pretty lethally the coyotes. They will fight the coyotes, whereas the horses and the cattle will just freeze and they'll go docile, especially the cattle. He's a sweet little. Come on. But they're really manic, and when the coyotes attack, they will kick like hell. We're getting more and more coyotes around here because I can hear them howling in packs at night. They roam typically between like 2 a.m. and 6 a.m. in the morning. Marilyn attracts them because she throws out scraps out in the backyard, and I know it's a good distance from the house, but she still doesn't realize that meat scraps and things will attract the wildlife. I think this house was built mid 1850s, and it was the manor house of a pretty vast amount of acreage. And Don and I think that there might have been steps leading from the ground floor to the second floor, because all of the windows are actually deeper on the second floor in height than they are on the ground floor. They're the same width, but the panes are actually deeper on the second floor, and there's window lights around the upstairs front door, and they aren't on the ground floor. So this might have been an arrangement where the more formal rooms were upstairs and the bedrooms were downstairs, kind of like at Maryland's, just a different interpretation.
Yeah, and these pillars on the bottom look like they're probably contemporary.
Yeah, they were rebuilt. Don has photographs, and they're also in my book, that show a completely altered front veranda that went across the entire ground floor, and it had sort of shed pitch roofs that went down to for rain runoff, and he rebuilt the whole ground floor pillars, so that's modern construction. But again, he thinks that there might have been steps that went from out here up to the second floor, which is more or less typical of the area. Look how tall Tanya's steps are up at that other house.
You want to talk about the landscaping and what would have been here historically, what's here now, and what your vision is?
Well, Don is lucky with a lot of legacy plants, which I have advised him not to remove just because of the sheer age, and we're going to try to incorporate some of them into the modern landscape. These are English boxwoods, which probably at one time lined the whole walkway, but don't know that for sure if there were steps here as the house was first built. But these are English boxwoods because they have that peppery smell.
Now, are those native?
No, English boxwood is European.
Okay, but they would have been here antebellum.
That's what, yeah, that was the primary landscape hedging in the 19th century in the South, from Virginia on, into probably over into Mississippi and Louisiana. Some of the original boxwood lined the walkway at the house across the street. But these four are original, but what my intention is to open up both sides of his front yard because they want more color. And this one, as soon as we get a little bit more rainfall and the weather gets colder, I'm going to get help to lift this one out, and this boxwood will go over to Here's someone. I think that must be Don. Here's
Hello.
Don. Good morning. You remember Chad Carlson from Atlanta with the DOT?
Yeah.
Hey, Don.
Hi, Chad.
He wanted to document not only a little bit more about your house, but what we envision to happen in the changing of your landscaping. And then I wanted him to be sure and know what I respect as the legacy plants around here. But because of the symmetry of the two sides of the yard, Chad, what I want to do is dig this one up, move the root ball so that it's positioned on this side. And what we're planning to do is make a symmetrical path on each side of the concrete walk so that you'll have paths that lead into the center gardens. This side of the property gets a lot more direct sun, although it's mostly morning and midday sun. So whatever plant material we put in over on this side would be that would require a little bit more light. Over here it's more shaded and it's going to be a simpler technique. But the fascinating thing that we found as I started wandering around this property is that Don has all these great old landscape features and pots that we were able to use in redesigning the two sides of the garden, and including the statue, which I think you said came from Milledgeville, didn't it, Don?
Yeah.
Well, we just moved it out last week from the backyard.
Yeah.
Oh, it looks
And
good up here.
Yeah, I think it's a perfect backdrop because the two Camellia japonicas probably are, I'm guessing, at least the big one there, 50 to 75 years old. The other one looks a little thin behind it, but it was completely covered with honeysuckle. So I've already trimmed the honeysuckle out of that. And I'm replanting additional evergreen Camellia varieties, although that one is a sasanqui. It will be an earlier bloom, the one that I just bought, put in that vacant space there.
And now, are those the kind of plants that would have been here around this time this house was built?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Camellias were prized southeastern landscape plants, and they would have been available through that nursery in Augusta or Savannah.
And could you talk?
There's a boxwood over there that's got to be original.
Yeah, this has to be, Chad, one of the first boxwoods that was planted. It is of a size that I have never encountered anywhere else in all of my travels in Georgia. In fact, I didn't even realize until Don pointed out to me a couple of years ago that this is actually a boxwood. But I mean, it has turned into a tree in the past 175 or so years, and it's still in pretty good health.
Now, how would you maintain something like that and try to keep it healthy?
Well, I think a lot of the shrubs probably could use some winter fertilization, but I wouldn't dare doing any kind of radical pruning or sawing of the limbs. I mean, this is a venerable tree, and I mean, it's so old that it has resurrection fern on part of it, which is pretty amazing. But
It almost looks like that tree in back of Glen Mary, the house. I don't know. I can't remember what the name.
that's, yeah, that one is a vitex, the one that blooms purple. But this is English boxwood. I mean, just a remarkable example of one that has weathered a lot of temperamental weather conditions, you know, over the.
So how long have you heard that boxwoods last? I mean, how long can they live?
Well, I've heard of them in Britain that are over 200 years old. I'm sure there are places in the American South, Virginia, you know, on through other deep South states that would have examples of boxwood. I've never been to Rosedown Plantation in Louisiana, but I understand they have some really old boxwood specimens too. But this is almost a miracle plant. And you know, if someone were to do ground penetrating radar, you know, investigate what's underneath the soil, they can tell where large root systems existed, just like they did at Maryland's place, and they can show where the original boxwood parterres might have been. And then there's a second one over here, Chad, that's not quite as large, but it's still a pretty significant size boxwood in itself.
And you can still buy this similar species today?
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Can you
But
talk?
I will show you in a moment what most landscape nurseries are selling. Instead of English boxwood, they're selling Korean boxwood, which is at the front of the house.
Okay.
It's more of a rampant grower. Don't cut your feet or anything.
No,
Huh? You're brave to be out in
I
the...
got cut.
This
I
is...
didn't wear shoes to school until Christmas every year.
Oh, wow.
So I had the bottom of my feet were like leather.
Wow. Chad, this is Korean boxwood, which a lot of people prefer now because it's less temperamental, but it's more of a rampant grower, as Asian species are. And the way that you can tell the difference is English boxwood has a scent. It has kind of a peppery smell it's very distinctive, and every time I smell it I think of Athens, because English boxwood was used so much in Athens and in Augusta to a large degree.
And the leaves
too.
look a little bit more refined on the English
They
boxwood.
are, yeah, they are.
Huh. Now, how do you maintain a plant like this? Could you just take a clippers and clip that up?
This will have to be hand pruned, and that's part of my responsibility here, is just to prune this down to a lower height. I don't like to cut any kind of shrubbery with electric clippers so that you get a flat plane on the top. I think that looks too harsh, especially in a historic setting.
But if you did do that, would it kill or adversely affect the plant if you just took a hedge clippers to it?
Most of the boxwoods are pretty forgiving, but in order to maintain formal boxwood hedges like probably would have existed here in the 19th century, they are pruned 2 or 3 times a year by hand. Thomas Jefferson was known to have trained young blacks at Monticello to do nothing but prune boxwood, and if they were sharp kids when they were young, they realized that if they had a specialized skill like that, they'd never have to go to the fields. They could be employed on a constant basis doing, and they'd have an easier job. It's like a lot of the mothers wanted to teach their daughters to cook and iron and sew because they would be employed in the household. They'd have an easier life if they had a skill.
Can you talk a little bit about the nursery in Augusta, Dennis? That some of these plants, when this house was built, might have been purchased from, like they were at Glen Mary.
Yeah, again, the antebellum house that is the clubhouse for the Augusta National Golf Club was originally an indigo plantation. It was built by Dennis Redmond, who published an agricultural journal in Augusta called the Southern Cultivator. And he was very interested in what was going on in Hancock County because this was considered kind of a Silicon Valley of experimental crop rotations and fertilizations, which a lot of other large farmers did not respect. They would wear out the land and they wouldn't rotate and replenish and plant green manure crops like alfalfa or clover. But the nursery in Augusta was called the Fruitlands Nursery. It was bought by a Belgian immigrant named Prosper Berkmans, and he operated at what was at the time one of the largest commercial nurseries in the South. And the owner of Glen Mary, and possibly of this estate too, would have had plant materials sent out from Augusta. And you know, the train didn't arrive in Sparta until the post-war years. So nothing could have been shipped by train until the late 19th century. So everything would have been carted in some kind of wagon, you know, between whatever the last railroad stop was, or they might have actually used a wagon to bring it all the way from Augusta. Augusta was the largest supplier of most plant material and a lot of building supplies that would have gone into the Oconee region of Georgia from, I'm sure, the early 19th century on through the antebellum years. But it was operated as a commercial nursery until the early 1930s, when Bobby Jones from Atlanta bought that property and created the Augusta National Golf Club on that land. It was that extensive.
Well, that's why it looks like the Garden of Eden.
Yeah, yeah.
Really?
Yeah, he said to think that this land has been lying here for close to 100 years, waiting for a golf course to be imprinted on it. And he really spoke wise words.
All right, we want to walk around a little bit more.
Oh, sure. This will be the side of the new garden that will contain more of the sun-loving plants.
You can see how much sun this side of the yard gets.
Oh yeah, and this would be great because a lot of plants that have bright color require more sunlight. So that's why we're doing a little bit more elaborate technique on this side. The sides of the house are approximately the same from edge to edge with the old picket fencing, but this one you'll see has at some time in the past been used as a planter bed. Don thought originally that it might have been an old well, but really the well is to the rear of the house. So I think that at some time they had a planter bed already here, and I'm having to deal with the masonry that was left over from a much earlier planting bed. I don't believe it was ever a well. I don't think they would have put the well in the front yard, nor would they have necessarily sited it this close to the front of the house.
Now, what's your plan for this?
Well, unlike a square configuration on the north side of the yard, the south side of the yard here is going to have a round circular walk path. That will be a planter bed in the center, and I'm going to use some of the original chimney pots, which we'll see in the backyard at the very center of this walk path. This will be a smaller extra circle of plant material, but I want the path to be wide enough so that they'll be able to walk around the edge, and then we'll plant probably a new little gem magnolia in the corner. We're talking about doing some kind of a gazebo or a pergola at this end of the property so that the edge of the rural side has some more camouflage against the barbed wire fence of the cow pasture.
Can you talk a little bit about the use of symmetry and how that was employed in that time period and why it was employed?
I think that the symmetrical arrangement of gardens was just reflective of the love of classical English traditions. And I always enjoy finding a property that allows me to do a symmetrical arrangement. We're really creating what are known now as garden rooms. They're not enclosed with high walls, but you get the impression that as you walk from one area of the front entrance, either north or south, you're going into an enclosed area that has a private garden and protected garden space. I do like to break up now and use a square configuration on one side and the round on the other. But as you can see, so many more of the legacy plants survived on the north side. We don't really know what would have been out here. I suspect that this depression is a result of some kind of tree that might have died years ago. But all of this side of the yard and the view into the cow pasture is going to be a little bit masked by some kind of a permanent structure here. They want a vine-covered pergola, or maybe a gazebo of some type here. We haven't arrived at the design yet. But
And would pergolas and gazebos been used antebellum or around that?
oh, most definitely. A lot of the pictures, including early photographs of Glen Mary, show them. And there's something online that shows some summer houses or gazebos that are down at the brick house, the Adams trailer house, down at the end of the road here. Had two of them out front. That's an interesting website. If you, just Google in Linton on the search engine, you'll be able to find a lot of fascinating pictures of 19th century and early 20th century Linton before it was altered so radically. And while a lot of the other houses were still standing.
Why would the plants on the north side have survived but not on the south side?
Camellias, for one thing, enjoy a little bit more of a semi-shaded environment. They will burn up if they get hot direct sun all summer long, and a lot of people don't think to water shrubbery. Everything is dependent on water in the worst part of the summer heat, and especially if we have a drought month like we did this year in June and early July. I mean, you have to water. So the bigger trees, crepe myrtles seem to weather drought and high heat better than a lot of other ornamental plantings, and I think that's why they continue to use them so frequently in southern states now, and also because they're so hardy in commercial settings. You see them everywhere in hard to landscape environments. They really are just tough plants.
All right, I want to walk around here and talk about what this is right here. Do you know what?
Well, Don and I've discussed this. I don't know whether it was a root cellar or it might have been used as a small greenhouse that would have protected tender plants. It has had some repair on the top edge with more modern brick, but as you can see, once you get down past 2 or 3 courses, the brick are the older local handmade brick. So it had some purpose in the antebellum years, and it has a brick retaining wall that goes all the way down to a very deep point in the ground. That's almost 7 feet deep or more. So I suspect that it could have served the purpose of a greenhouse, or it could have been a place where they sprouted seeds to put into vegetable gardens.
There was a wooden structure with glass in it.
Could it have been a place to put dairy products to keep cool?
That is a possibility. Although I would think if it had an early use of refrigeration, it might have been at the back. But are you saying, Don, that it had a peaked roof?
I don't think it had a peaked roof. I think it was a flat roof coming back this way.
And it had glass panes.
Yeah.
And you can see, Chad, that there was the framing for a structure that would have held glass. So that would have allowed it to heat up. Root cellars weren't as widely used in the southern states. I'm sure some people had them, but we have such high humidities in the ground soil down south, and I don't know that that would have been necessarily as effective a way to save rutabagas or potatoes or things like that. And actually a lot of root vegetables in the south can stay buried in the ground all winter long, and they're fine.
Look how the brick changes color going down.
Yeah.
I wonder what that's all about.
Well, it was painted. I'm sure that's fragments of green paint that have just been more protected from water runoff, through the years. But this one, again, I think was a planter bed. It is symmetrical, and I'm going to have a challenge, kind of working that in, but we can do so. The planter bed in the center is not going to extend quite that far out, because most of this is going to be a walk path. and then it will lead to either a pergola or a gazebo where Don is standing, and then we're going to fill in this area with more colorful summer blooming plants, which like more sun. The other one is going to have to be planned so that you put in shrubbery and plants that like the shade. And Don tells me he doesn't have much problem with the rampaging deer here, but I think the picket fence and the fact that he's a little bit closer to the road, you know, gives him protection against the deer.
Now, will they eat boxwood?
I can't answer that. I'm not sure whether that's one of the
I don't think
species.
they would, or these wouldn't be so
Yeah,
rampant.
they have that scent, and it might be something that the deer just don't like the smell. I mean, it's a very nostalgic scent for me because I associate it with old properties in my childhood, and you'd be surprised how many large estates that have disappeared or burned through the years will still have ancient boxwood gardens in place. And I think that one across the road is pretty remarkable, although it's been likely manicured a little bit more.
A walkway going to the front steps.
Yeah.
Now, Dennis, you had mentioned your childhood. What's your background as far as going back to where you were from?
I'm originally from Augusta. My family owned a dairy farm in the western part of Richmond County. And when I was a very young kid, there was a nursery that operated just down the road from me, and I would go up there and just hang out and watch some of the rootings of shrubbery and planting of seed flats and things. It was called the Mayo Nursery, and it was a pretty big operation in its time, and they employed a lot of folks that lived around on our varying properties, and they would let me come over even when I was 4 and 5 years old and just see how they were working. And pick up technique. The owners, Mr. and Mrs. Mayo, were longtime friends of my grandparents, and they didn't mind my hanging around over there. They liked me, and they thought it was unusual that a kid of that age would have had the interest in what was their professional vocation. And they were a very successful nursery in their time, all the way through the 50s, but it eventually just played out as the owners got too old to manage it. But that kind of created an interest in gardening, and of course we had very lavish gardens around all of the family properties. Even though it was farm property, the area closest to the old houses all had legacy plant materials. As a matter of fact, Don has a shrub over here called Breath of Spring. It's Linicera fragrantissima.
Wanna go over there?
Yeah, it blooms in February typically. Really sweet smell. We are lucky enough to live in a climate zone where there can be something in bloom 12 months out of the year if it's planned effectively. But yeah, this is a very mature Linicera fragrantissima. It's called winter honeysuckle. My folks always called it breath of spring because it's kind of a harbinger of the change of seasons. But typically this plant will start blooming in February.
And what kind of blooms does it have?
It looks like a small hibiscus. I'm sorry, Don?
It has little balls that are kind of like about the size of a marble or something.
Yeah, something like that, yeah.
And what would the color be?
They're a creamy white.
Yeah.
Of course, these are all indica azaleas, which are the old-fashioned azaleas. And they are only a spring bloomer. This was widely planted before the encore hybrids of modern azaleas came into existence, so they only bloom one time a year in the spring. Interestingly, this area over here, which also gets a little bit more sunlight, is another area that we want to develop an herb garden for Jane. I'll put up another small square picket fence, and we're going to plant that with herbs that she can use in the kitchen. It's just sitting here crying out for a new herb garden. But there are just great legacy plants all over this property. These, of course, are forsythia. They're spring blooming. This is an Althea or Rose of Sharon. Don has mentioned that in California there's a lot heavier bloom. The reason that this one probably doesn't have quite as much thick summer bloom is because it's a little more shaded on this side of the house than it would be if it were on the other. But I have a small one which we can plant on your other side, so maybe we'll all be around to see it get this large and have more bloom.
And then do you have any?
This is something that I think is worthy of noting, how many of the original outbuildings still exist close to this house. I used to wonder why there were different angles of the buildings back here until I realized that everything that isn't perpendicular to the lines of the house are newer buildings. This well house is the old one, and there are two smokehouses, and we're presuming that there was a kitchen right behind the house as well, because there's some steps leading down the hill.
To the garden.
To the garden. I see. Oh, okay. And they would have probably had an outside kitchen somewhere on the property. That was typical.
Well, I think it was right where they steps.
Yeah.
I think where my truck is parked is where the kitchen used to be.
Okay.
I'm just guessing.
Well, that's very likely, because all of this is a modern addition.
Yeah.
The back of the house would have been at the point of the rear exterior wall. So all of the modern addition has taken place at the back of the house. So there would have been a lot more room right back out here. But, you know, it speaks of a very wealthy family to have had two smokehouses rather than just one.
So these two are in the back are the smokehouses right here?
Yeah. The little building over there with the notched log, John said he had moved it here from another property. And don't touch the story on the slave house in the back. Was that here originally, or?
It's a two-room slave house.
That's something that you should see if
But
you
it
have.
would take serious money to.
Oh, absolutely.
And now is this
About to fall down.
is this building original to the property, Don?
I'm presuming it would be. That's your corn crib and hayloft in the big barn, and then this would have been a supplementary barn, and they could have actually kept animals in the lower side of this, because you can see where the threshold is actually worn by the hoofs of cattle or horses or mules at the bottom of the door, where they've actually worn the board from their hoofs hitting the side. Do you mind if we open the door?
Go right
Sure.
ahead. I don't have any secrets.
It's interesting that they still have the original crafted support to lock it up. But this has a dirt floor, so animals could have very easily been sheltered in here. You know, in the coldest weather or in times of sleet or ice or anything like that, it would have been a help. Not a lot of southern people cared enough about their livestock to bring them inside during the worst weather. It was popularly thought that they would be fine outdoors, but for those that had the means to provide shelter, I'm sure it was very comfortable for the animals.
And then what would have been kept in this main part? Just agricultural product?
Sure. Supplies. There are some remarkable antique implements and cotton baskets that were hand woven out of split white oak.
Look at all these cotton baskets. And look, this is interesting. This is a racing Surrey. It had great big wheels at the back with the horse between these.
So those cotton baskets, do you think they're original to the property?
Yeah, it's a miracle to me that they're here.
That's amazing.
That's a toolbox there, and that's a toolbox there. And
Now-
there was a family that we bought the house from that they were from Atlanta. They didn't know much about what they were doing. Look at this homemade wheel here. I guess that would have been on the front end of a wheelbarrow.
Very likely.
They even had metal on the edge of it.
And then look at this old, these, look at what are they, some kind of harnesses or something it looks like.
Yeah, there are a lot of hames. And then, this is interesting, this is the framework for a little sulky, like a one-horse
Yeah.
carriage
Yeah.
that they would have probably used, you know, just to go to church on Sunday or something. It wouldn't have been a utilitarian.
Now, the shutters, Don, are those to this house?
Yes. Well, now, there's window frames up there that don't belong to this house, but all of these probably were used on the house.
Huh.
You know, these cotton baskets were made out of split white oak. Probably all created in this vicinity. There were some individuals who specialized in doing nothing but basket weaving.
Yeah, and from my understanding, the properties around here would have had a lot of white oak.
Oh yeah, sure. You still see a good bit of it.
Look at these hinges. God, you know, they were made to hold a lot more weight than is on them.
That's fascinating.
One of my architect friends in Charlottesville, Virginia, said that the reason that most of the outbuildings in this area are so dark is that rather than painting, they applied boiled linseed oil, and it soaked into the wood, and it allowed the wood to breathe. And you can see how well that technique preserved wood. Almost every barn that you see in this part of Georgia has this very dark brown or almost black appearance. And they found out very early that painting utilitarian structures caused the wood to rot because paint actually seals water in the wood. So they put the 2 or 3 year painting cycle into the dwelling houses, not the outbuildings. But they did need some kind of preservative, and he said it was just boiled linseed oil, which was very popular as a wood preservative in the era. And it was the basis for a lot of paint as well. But if they put opaque pigments like white or yellow clay pigments or something into the oil and blended it into a paint service, then it requires more maintenance on a yearly basis. So they used a wood preservative which was known well to them at the time. But until the fellow from Charlottesville told me that, I never realized why they all were so universally dark and yet very well preserved. My own barn up the road was built at the same time as my house, and that was 1850, and it's never been painted.
And what would have they used for the roofs back then?
Wood shingles.
Wood shingles?
Split wood shingles.
Well, you can still look over here. The shingles are still here under the chimney. Right here. You can still see the wood shingles.
A lot of times this was oak as well, if they used local wood. And I think in the 19th century there were probably a lot more ball cypress trees in the swamps. And the cypress is a little bit longer lasting natural wood because it has the natural oil that would have protected the cypress from rotting. But a lot of the shingles were oak.
Oh, here's the, are these the chimneys? Can you
Yeah,
talk a little bit about these?
These are chimney pots that would have sat at the very top of the chimneys.
And those were used to facilitate draft up through the chimney,
Yeah,
the narrow space.
Right, that's what your friend Boyd told you last week. It creates an updraft but they were kind of a pricey building material, and you don't see many of them this far into the interior of the state. I noticed some in Sparta last week after I discovered these. There are a couple of houses in Sparta that have them too that have never been removed, but they've been painted gray.
Now you're intending to incorporate those in the landscaping?
Absolutely. Both of these are going to be used as part of the landscape feature. Possibly the thicker one will go into the herb garden, but I know I'm going to use the darker one that's a little bit narrower in the south side.
This over here looks like it's original to the property.
That's a horse trough.
And, you know, right behind the well, so it would have been easy to draw buckets of water and fill the trough for the animals. And that's why I think this is the original site of the well. And Don says there's still water in it.
Oh,
and
yeah.
It has all the
I don't want to drink it.
And this is the same location pretty much as Glen Mary's well.
yeah.
So the kitchen probably would have been,
Well, I'm thinking Don is correct that it might have been right out in this area where this truck is.
yeah.
There could be some excavation that would show the foundations. Don, you had a special name for that tunnel you told me last week. I had forgotten.
Tickle.
Tickle, yeah.
I've heard that called tickle my whole life. It just got in the water.
Wow, so there's still water down there? You can,
I don't know that I'd want to drink it, but it's there. Hold that down.
The higher it goes, the harder it is. I remember doing
I got my bucket with a 22.
that. Can I help you with that, Don?
I'm just gonna let it down. And I'm gonna clean up all this junk in here.
It's pretty remarkable, isn't it, Chad? A lot of them have gone dry. And in the 19th century, a lot of times the families in dry weather would have the challenge of the water receding, and people would actually go into the wells and dig them out. But a lot of people were killed with methane gas, because when they get down to the level of that depth, there's a buildup of methane gas. And I had an ancestor that was killed that way in the 1880s. Just a young kid, 17 years old maybe at most, and he was the one that they sent down the well to dig it out, and he died from breathing the methane.
now you can tell with the brick foundation on these buildings that these are much later.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's asbestos siding, which is not dangerous. It's got 10 coats of white paint on
Yeah,
it.
as long as it's
Sealed.
sealed.
Yeah.
And that was something that came along after the end of the Second World War. I think
Right.
that it was not a building material that was used.
Right, and those brick almost look like 50s and 60s
This
on.
is a garage.
Okay.
So this is a modern building, and it's interesting to me to see how so many of the original buildings are parallel to the lines of the main house.
I think this was a chicken coop. There was places for them to roost
Oh, okay.
back there.
That's very likely.
I don't see any cross beams that would be for the meat. I wonder if this is have any cross beams over here.
That
Yeah.
one does.
Yeah.
So yeah, this one.
Open that door if you want to. It's a
Yeah.
mess.
This
My
is
house-
likely a poultry shed.
There's something odd right here, though. Look at this. There's a fancy door lock right there with the remnants of one. But then, look right here. I don't think I've even showed you this, Jim. There's a misspelling of the word sorrow here. Step inside there and look back this way. It's S-O-R-R-O-U-G-H.
That's fascinating.
I have no idea. I mean, it's a mystery, you know, to me.
Well, if some of Sherman's bummers did come through Linton and stole all the hams and bacon, I guess it would be a sorrowful day, but that is a peculiar spelling.
Yeah.
That is really interesting.
And a lot of these implements, you know, span the decades. This is some grain cutting site, and it has some, you know, the additions that, I mean, these are what would have been used to hold the implement with the hands. You'd have to swing a scythe
Yeah,
with
this
both
still got
hands.
the blade on it. Boy, that would have been a hard day's work.
Yes, sir.
Now this is always curious. I've seen this before in other doors where you have all these additional nails, and I've heard speculation that maybe they would have put some kind of animal skin as additional protection against the elements, and they would have hammered it on there. I don't know if you guys know anything about that.
I hadn't heard that.
Double-sided doors would have been much stouter, and that would also guard against theft.
Well, this had a lock on the inside, which is odd.
Yeah.
It's just curious that they use so many nails. Yeah, you can see the cross beams in here, so this was probably a smokehouse.
And there's nails where they hung stuff. You can see. I got crap hanging from them, but there's nails where that would have been where they would have left the cured hams, I guess.
Yeah. But you're right, Don. That one has a little bit looser construction technique, so it would have air to get in and circulate for the poultry. Well, you're quite right. I always thought they were just lucky and had a lot of preserved meats, but that's likely more a chicken shed.
Want to take a cruise down to the back and see what the...
Yeah, you can see the building from the edge of this fence line. And I would presume it was either an original slave house or it would have been a tenant house.
I'm not going to walk back there with y'all, but there's a clear lane to walk down. This actually was probably really pretty once upon a time.
I just recently discovered that lane last week.
Do you know what this is?
Mm-mm.
It's a washing machine. They boil their clothing.
And that's original to the property?
Yeah.
We're going to use that somewhere in the backyard. They make a nice printing.
Yeah, this setup back here is almost as interesting as the house itself.
I like the house better. There's some neat stuff in the house that I'll show you.
And you notice how they ditched the edge of the roadbed, Chad, so that they had water drainage that would flow on either side of the... This would have been just a service road. And,
But it was planted with big cedars all the way down.
yeah. I didn't realize that there were these really ancient legacy cedars along this roadbed.
And at the very back of the property, there's about a 12-foot gully that I don't know what the story on that is. I'm gonna let y'all go to the slave house.
Okay, we'll be back in just maybe 10 minutes or so.
All right, close this up.
I will.
Cows will get out.
I will. Yeah, Don has a neighbor with Black Angus cattle, and they use this part of his property for pasturing. But it's really a magnificent lane. There were probably a lot more old cedars here that have either fallen or been cut down through the years. And you can see how long that wood will last and survive. But this is a really substantially engineered roadbed for the time that it was created. And very effectively dipped so that it would always stay dry.
Any particular reason why they use cedar?
Well, cedar is native, the red cedar, but the reason that you see a lot of it along fence lines is because birds will eat the seed and the berries, and they will sit on fence lines. That's why you see all over the countryside cedars aligned along old fence lines, because the birds eat the seed, poop out the seeds, and they sprout wherever they were roosting on the edge of the fence. So that's the reason that you often see cedars aligned. They weren't planted that way. It's just a coincidence. I'm sure a lot of the really old ones, spider web.
So it wasn't design planting. It's just an ancillary effect of birds perching on the fence.
I think that a lot of people did plant cedars ornamentally, but when you see so many, especially young cedars like this, you know, that wouldn't be antebellum planting. That's just a coincidence that the birds eat the seed.
Oh, look at this structure. Is that?
Could have been an old dog house.
No, this big house in the back.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, is that where we're going?
No, this one I was talking about was here. I never realized, I've never been back in here. Now that's an old structure.
We'll have to ask Don about that.
Yeah, I did not know that one was there. I've never been back this far.
Now I've heard cedars also are good in keeping mosquitoes away and that chickens like to roost in them. Is that true?
I couldn't answer with veracity on that. I know that guinea fowl will fly up into trees, but typically other domesticated chickens don't fly that high, but they might. But that's a pretty old structure. You can see the old brick. I don't know whether we're looking at the side or the front or the back, but you know, that's a really ancient building.
Yeah,
would have housed someone.
We'll have to try to figure out how to get back there. Now, Dennis, what's that structure, that white structure in the back of the field there?
That would have been the old Linton General Store. And it, I think, was open for business all the way through the 1970s. It was pretty much the social center of Linton.
What's your take on this building?
I think it's very possibly a slave house. Or it could have been built later in the 19th century, and it would have just housed tenant families. It would take a professional to know the true age, but
that chimney, the chimney almost looks mid 20th century.
This one does, but I think the older one may be original, and it would have served fireplaces on each side. There would have been a hearth probably on each side of these rooms. But, you know, it's kind of like a duplex.
Well, and it's got the round nail heads. I don't see any square nail heads, which would indicate pre-1880s, 1890s.
Right.
Now with the chimney in the center and a room on either side, that would have typically been called a saddlebag house.
Yeah, sure. And it has, two doorway openings on the other side. head nails could have possibly been used to affix this tar paper. You're right, I don't see any square nails. They had a step. They had a step that made it out of the rock. That's probably what would have been the step to go into that room. But you can see, yeah, I mean, this would have housed probably two different families or two individuals because it has the two doorways and two fireplaces.
These timbers definitely look antebellum. The support timbers, the sill.
Yeah.
And then that chimney, that central located chimney, that looks antebellum too. And with the slave cabins, it would have very typical.
Right.
You'd have one family on either side using opposite ends of the chimney. It could be that, you know, this was just reconstructed around the existing chimney and the existing sills.
That is very possible. You know, a lot of the wood would have rotted out over time, and they simply used materials that came into availability later. Yeah, there have been a lot of repairs made to this.